Okay, so I had this idea. I grew up in a very conservative home, grew up in a very traditional conservative church, and, I am very familiar with the church lady concept. I don't know if you remember that from Saturday Night Live, well, isn't that special? This idea of a holier than thou, ready to judge everyone around them type of mentality. That was only sort of fake. Like, there were really people like that out there. And I was, one of the things I noticed about those people as I still went to churches like that before I left when I became an adult, I noticed that they had no sense of humor. You couldn't joke with them about stuff because they took everything so seriously. And I also noticed that they weren't very creative. Like, think about Christian movies in the 1980s and 90s. They were terrible. They were painful to watch for anybody who knows anything about film, and even most people who don't. They just weren't entertaining, and they didn't get their message across well at all. Why is that? It's because the church at the time was all about the message being exactly right. It was very focused on right and wrong and less about the people that were being affected by the stuff that they did. And I was listening to a political commentator talk, and he said this comment. He said, "The left can't meme." Now, first of all, I had never heard the word meme used as a verb before, so that was a new one for me. But even aside from that, the left can't meme. Why can't leftists create memes? And he gave a bunch of examples, and man, he wasn't wrong. Their memes are terrible. They're not funny, they're not creative, they're not entertaining, and they don't get their message across correctly. And it struck me how similar this modern leftist, anti-racist, bigotry sort of BLM, type of movement, they've become the church lady. Now hear me out. I remember when liberals were very into liberality, when you could do whatever you wanted. Today, liberals don't seem to be that way anymore. They seem more to be about morality from their perspective. Rather than saying people shouldn't sleep together before marriage, they're saying you shouldn't ever call somebody by a gendered pronoun, or at least don't use the gendered pronoun they don't like. It's the same mentality. It's just a different target. It's like these people are doing the same thing the church people did, trying to control behavior, and through external means, they're just controlling it a different direction. And so this new staunch left is really a religious movement, a religious morality movement. And their morality is just different than what Christian morality is. So let me give you some examples. I know you're like, that's stupid. This can't be possible. Let me give you some examples, try to convince you. First of all, there's no flexibility of beliefs. Like, everyone has to believe exactly the same thing. And they will tear you apart if you claim to believe anything different than what they do. If there was I saw a video of a group of BLM protesters, and they were shouting at this guy, "Say Black Lives Matter. Say Black Lives Matter." And he was like, "I believe Black Lives Matter." "No, I want you to say Black Lives Matter." And he said, you can't make me say anything." And they beat him up. What? He was one of them. But you can't have any flexibility. Everyone has to be together believing the same thing. Well, that's exactly what conservative Christianity was when I was a kid growing up in the late 80s, early 90s. You had to believe the same thing that everyone else did because that's how you got to heaven. The next thing is no tolerance for outsiders. The church was very intolerant towards people of different religions, people of different beliefs on morality, certainly people with different sexual orientations, different beliefs about whether or not, what's okay sexually. Sex had a lot to do with it. And they were very intolerant of people who were different than them. And liberals were not. They were very tolerant. In fact, they taught tolerance so much it made the conservative Christians choke on it and say, we're going to be intolerant. We can't tolerate negativity and bad stuff. And the church lost a lot of ground in the community and in the culture because of that, because they refused to accept people who were different than them. Jesus accepted people who were different than them. And now today we see the same thing. Leftists are saying, if you don't just, completely go along with what we're saying, then you're a white supremacist, you're a racist, you're a hater, you're a homophobe, you're a xenophobe, you're a Islamophobe. I mean, add phobe to anything you want, and that's what they'll call you if you're not one of them. How about no grace for mistakes? People who were divorced back in those days, and the numbers were starting to rise. In the church, it wasn't quite as fast, but it did start to rise in the church. And people were like, look, if you get divorced, you're not welcome here. You cannot make that decision. That's not okay with God. You will sin, and there's no forgiveness for that. If people, stumble into drunkenness or fall back into addiction, they just shunned them. They kicked him out. They tried to use, negativity to motivate people, and it didn't work. Well, now the left is doing the same thing. They're digging up photographs of people from the 70s and 80s and showing, look, you put on blackface in 1982. It was still okay in 1982. I mean, it wasn't morally okay, but people didn't think it was something worth condemning. But there's no grace for mistakes. When people just make a slight error, and they say something a little bit wrong in their tweet or their text or their Instagram post or whatever, they will jump down their throat and attack them for not being exactly right. It's the same as the conservative Christians in the 80s and 90s. How about no grace for sin? Christians couldn't accept homosexuals during that time. And I know there was a lot of political battles, and I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Christians assuming that homosexuals were evil. They weren't just in sin. They were bad people. They were so perverse that we should be able to discriminate against them and hate them and do all kinds of nasty things to them. Not all of them, understand. I'm talking about the majority. Well, that sort of behavior has now moved into the left sphere. And instead of saying, no grace for sin in that, it's like, as far as homosexual goes, if you don't, if you're a sinner in misgendering someone, if you're a sinner in not espousing the ideology of Marxism or whatever it is, then you're an outcast. There's no grace for sinners in the far left. And then, of course, one of these I said before, no sense of humor. You couldn't tell jokes from the pulpit. I tried. I got in trouble for it. You can't make jokes about important things. You certainly couldn't make jokes about Jesus. And I'm thinking, I'm sure Jesus had a sense of humor. He knows we love to laugh, and he's not above, making fun of himself on occasion. He's done it with me. And so I look at liberals and I see the same thing. There's no sense of humor. Look at how they attack comedians almost more than anything, or at least they did for a couple of years, where it was just this constant barrage of, you can't joke about that. You joke about these things. And the leftist comedians weren't funny because you can't make jokes when you take everything so seriously. It's the same thing. No freedom of information. One of the things I thought was most interesting as I grew out of the conservative-controlled Christian environment was I wasn't told everything about the Bible. Like, there were things I didn't know about its history and how it was put together. I didn't know about all the different fragments and all of the different variants that were there. I learned some of those things because of reading different translations. And I thought, wait a minute, that wasn't in this other Bible. What's going on? And I found out there were discrepancies. It's nothing to consider the Bible to not be, the Word of God. I'm just saying that there was stuff that I wasn't told about that. There was stuff I wasn't told about how the church ran and how people behaved behind the scenes. And, they controlled information because they were afraid that the wrong information would turn people the wrong direction. And you couldn't turn people the wrong direction because then they would go to hell forever. Do you understand? The stakes were too high to take a chance. Well, now that's the left. We've got to fix this country. It's so full of racism. We've got to do something to make things better. And it's worth sacrificing every individual who's not like us in order to get there. The stakes are too high. So they hide information. They give out misinformation. They pretend things that don't happen. They're like that. We pretend that they pretend that these things, innocents being killed by cops. And you're like, wait a minute, that guy wasn't innocent. Or they'll pretend that things don't happen where, a black on black crime, that's not really a thing, or at least they won't talk about it. Hiding information and putting out incorrect information is very common in the left, just like it was in Christian communities. And this one I find so sad, because it's sad that the left is this way, but in my opinion, it's even sadder that Christians were this way. There was no love for people. There was love for truth. But you could sacrifice people to get to truth, which of course is oxymoronic. You really can't. But people would do that, and the left does that too. They'll sacrifice even their own if it means getting to the ends that they think are justified. Well, God cares about people, all of them, even the ones that hate him, even the leftists. And so we should too. And Christians were pretty good about not loving those that weren't like them. And they were accused of it, and rightfully so. But now the left is doing it too. They're hating everyone who's different. They refuse to love people, and they'll put truth above people. The truth that they believe, by the way. A little bit more, the Christians were very dogmatic about their theology, and so are leftists. The Christians were quick to condemn people, and so are leftists. And the Christians were full of hatred and contempt, and so are leftists. I'm telling you guys, I don't know what this human tendency is that produces these kinds of people, but they have left the church, and they have entered the sphere of the left. And that's all we got time for today. Thanks, guys.